Welcome to our very first Postcards from the Fringe video. And for this very first video, we're actually shooting in the central Queensland town of Rockhampton. Now, Rockhampton has a bit of a special place in my heart as far as my family history is concerned. My great-great-great-uncle back in about 1860, 1861 travelled up to what wasn't very much more than a couple of small farms to help the Archer brothers work Gracemere Station. Now, in 1868, very unfortunately, he was trying to move some cattle across the Fitzroy River and was thrown from his horse into the river, and as a result he drowned. Now, he's buried over at Gracemere Station in the little graveyard that's just in behind the homestead there. But very interestingly, there's another ghost story that is said to occur on the Fitzroy River just off Quay Street. Now, I've got historic Quay Street that's just behind me here. A lot of incredible historic buildings that are along here. For anyone who knows the area, they'll know that the very haunted Criterion Hotel is at the end of Quay Street here, not very far behind me. But this story has to do with an apparition that is said to turn up annually and cross Quay Street, and is quite an interesting anecdotal story. Now, it was published in one of the local newspapers in the 1930s. They gave quite a bit of detail as to this story as well. So what we'll do is we'll have a little bit of a listen to the story, and then we'll see if we've got any historical basis for it. But first, let's have a look at the details.
It's a lone brick building standing on the waterfront in Quay Street. It bears strong evidence of having seen better days. Most of the glass, which at one time glazed its windows, has gone to be replaced with sheets of iron and bits of weatherboard. Though so old, this pile of bricks and mortar has a solid sort of appearance in the sunlight of the day. Its chipped old plaster face looks knowingly into a midday sun and seems almost to whisper a story. To those able to understand, I'm telling a tale which, for all of its improbability, is true. An old man seated near the riverbank confirmed a hearsay story which had come our way. Here it is, for what it's worth, to you. Years ago, when Rockhampton's waterfront was a scene of greater activity than it is today, that old house was occupied by a young doctor. His practice was confined mostly to accidents and sickness, connected with the ships which tied up so close to his door, or to the rehabilitating of sailors who had gazed too long and perhaps too lovingly on bottles of Nelson's blood, strong rum, and to which, in the days of iron men and wooden ships, the crews of visiting vessels were most partial. One night, at a time when the waterfront was quiet and idle, and most of Rockhampton slept, a man was seen to stagger to the door of number 274 and knock. The door opened and the man was admitted to the house. That fact was confirmed by a night watchman from a ship which was moored hard by. The watchman knew the man who had entered the house to be a member of the crew of a ship he was on. He knew the man to be always in trouble on shore, and so for him to visit a doctor at any hour did not surprise the watchman. Half an hour later, the watchman was not disturbed to hear the front door of the doctor's house open again and to see the sailor, his arm encased in a white sling, walk straight across the road. He saw the man stand at the old wooden bollard to which the mooring lines of the ships were attached and take off his cap, which he placed on the bollard itself, and, with hardly a pause, walk slowly onto the old wharf which stands battered and broken opposite the doctor's old house today. But what did surprise the night watchman was that the injured man, reaching the edge of the jetty, should turn to face him and, as though to indicate a farewell, raise his uninjured arm in salutation, then, turning on his heel, walk straight off the jetty into the water. There was a splash, then silence. The night watchman got busy. He roused some members of the ship's crew together with an officer. Lights were forthcoming and a thorough search made of the river at the spot where the man had been seen to disappear. The morning sun, rising, found the search still in progress. Hour succeeded hour, and men looked in vain. The mystery deepened when, on going to the doctor's house for information as to the apparently drowned man's injuries, the doctor was not at home and had not been in the house for many hours prior to the time the watchman had apparently seen the man enter. In fact, When police and ship's officers inquired about him, the doctor proved conclusively that at the time of the supposed visit of the man to the house, he had been out of Rockhampton and had remained away from the city for many hours after the man's disappearance. The doctor lived alone, and the house was empty of any living soul during the whole time of the queer happenings. That the watchman had been mistaken seems disproved by two concrete facts. The injured man's cap was found on the wooden bollard, and strongest evidence of all, the owner of the cap was definitely missing. In fact, he was never seen again. Time, tide, and ships wait for no man. In due course, the ship sailed, and here the story might have ended, but for one curious thing. The incidents recorded had happened on a cold, bleak night in June, and during the following year, at the same time, and to be exact, for every year since, a strange apparition is said to leave that old house by the front door and disappear into the river. This old house stands today, a relic of those long-forgotten days. The man who related this story, while not himself remembering those days, vouches for its authenticity. The details, he says, are known to be true by many old inhabitants of this city. That is the story. It is given to you as it was passed to me. That there is nothing in it seems highly probable, but again, is it so improbable? Stand alone in Quay Street under the trees at night when the city is very still. In the quiet and hushed calmness with which the front of that old house presents itself, try to visualise the happening. There is something eerie about the surroundings of that little bit of Quay Street. For preference, go to the spot on a cold, damp night and stand and listen. The soft, swirling waters of the river, the drip of raindrops from the trees which line the street, the scurry of a rat as it seeks shelter from the misery of its surroundings, and the ghostly silence of the tumble-down wharf. Then picture to yourself the tread of the missing man across the road to the jetty, the fall into the water, a scream, then silence, and still the raindrops from the trees.
So now, having heard the ghost story, probably one of the biggest standout details when we have a bit of a look at whether there's any truth behind it or not is the number of Quay Street that the story gives. Now, it gives it as 274 Quay Street. There's no building there anymore, apart from K&S Timbers that's behind me. It's at number 274. So if we roughly take that as being where 274 was back in the late 1800s, we can assume that the building that it's talking about would have been pretty much behind me, and right in front of me on the Fitzroy River is the remains of the old wharf precinct. Now, what we do know is that a building did exist at probably roughly where number 274 Quay Street was, directly across from the wharf. And I'd stumbled across an old photo that was published in the local newspaper in 1933. Now, it gives the details of the house as being a boarding house at the time in the early 1930s, but having once been used by a surgeon by the name of Dr. Thon. Now, Dr. Thon, through the 1870s, 1880s, right up to 1891 when he finally passed away, was an immigration doctor. So there does seem to be some truth to there being a doctor's residence behind me that was in practice at one point in time. Now, when we have a look at Dr. Thon's death in 1891, he'd stopped using that building a little while prior to his death. So if there's any kind of story that has to do with a drowning and a body being not found in the Fitzroy River, we would kind of expect it to be maybe before 1891. However, when we go through the newspapers, there's an actually fascinating story that was published about an event that occurred in 1898. And I've got the little article here. It was published in the Morning Bulletin on the 15th of January 1898. And there's a lot of little details in this story that absolutely align with our ghost story, including the little piece about the cat being left behind. Now, we'll have a bit of a look at the story. It goes, a man named Thomas Monaghan, a fireman employed on board the SS Rob Roy, is supposed to have met his death by drowning in the Fitzroy River on Thursday night. The steamer was lying at the Deepwater Wharf, which is just behind me here on the Fitzroy River. About 10 o'clock, Monaghan went to the cabin of the second engineer and said he was going ashore to have a drink. The engineer said, "Do not go, Tom. Go and have a lie down." Monaghan walked away, leaving his cap behind him. So remember that detail about the cap. About the same time, probably immediately after he left the second engineer, he went to the lamplighter, borrowed his southwester and oilskin coat, and walked the gangway onto the wharf. Presently, a cry came from the wharf that the man had fallen into the river. The cry was heard on the Rob Roy, and officers and men turned out at once. A search was made for Monaghan, but he could not be found either on the wharf or on the ship, nor could any intelligence be obtained of him at the hotels near the wharf. Whilst this search was going on, a boat was lowered and a party rowed about in the neighbourhood of the steamer for some time in the hope of being able to render some assistance to whoever had fallen in, but finding it was useless to pursue the task longer, gave it up. Up until the time the Rob Roy sailed, so the ship actually left without this chap Thomas Monaghan being found, no trace of Monaghan was discovered, and the police had a boat's crew out yesterday dragging the river in the expectation of finding his body. Monaghan was a man of about 55 years of age and unmarried. He was a native of Ireland and had been on the Rob Roy since February last, so since February 1897, or potentially 1898, and besides being a first-class fireman, he was a general favourite amongst his fellows on board the ship. So we definitely know that we had a house that was behind me that was used by a doctor at one time. We've got a story from 1898 of a seaman who decided to go ashore to have a few drinks, fell off the wharf after leaving his cap on board, and his body was never found before the ship finally sailed away. Now, is that the genesis of our story? It sounds very much like the story that was published in the late 1930s in the Morning Bulletin. It's very, very hard to tell. Obviously, it's near impossible to put a name on a ghost unless that ghost taps you on the shoulder and introduces themselves. But it's a fascinating story, historical story of early Rockhampton that aligns with a ghost story that was being told almost 4 decades later. Now, I probably would say that there's always some kind of tidbit of truth in any good ghost story. As to investigating it, I'll leave that up to the local paranormal groups to pick apart and maybe do a bit of an investigation at some time. So remember, if you like these videos, they're going to be going up every night for the next week between now and Friday. Make sure to like and share these videos around, and we'll catch you for the next episode that'll go up tomorrow night. See you all later.